They were told Americans would torture them, starve them, and strip them of dignity. But when Japanese prisoners stepped into Camp McCoy in 1944, the enemy broke them not with violence, but with hamburgers and Coca-Cola. They expected the end, not survival. When the train doors clattered open in the biting Wisconsin cold of 1944, dozens of Japanese soldiers stepped down onto the snow-packed ground, blinking against the pale light. Their uniforms were torn, some held together with thread or strips of cloth. Hunger showed in their faces, with hollow cheeks, tired eyes, and lips cracked from weeks of short rations and transport. Each man had been taught the same lesson since his first day in the Imperial Army. Capture was shame. Capture was worse than death. They had been warned that the Americans would torture them, starve them, and humiliate them until they begged for mercy. Many had prepared themselves to be struck down the moment they left the train. Instead, what they saw made them hesitate. Rows of wooden barracks stood against the snow, guard towers, barbed wire, and a few sentries with rifles. But the atmosphere was not what they had pictured. There was order here, even a kind of quiet routine. Trucks passed through the camp roads, and smoke from kitchen chimneys carried the smell of cooking food. Rich food far stronger than the weak soups they had lived on for months. Some of the prisoners exchanged nervous glances. Others kept their eyes low, unwilling to betray even a spark of curiosity. The guards shouted commands in English, crisp and fast. The prisoners did not understand most of it, but the tone was firm, not savage. Interpreters explained, "Line up, move forward, do not break formation." Red Cross officials observed from the sidelines, clipboards in hand. That presence alone startled the prisoners. Back home, they had been told America was lawless, brutal, indifferent to treaties. Yet here were outsiders ensuring rules were followed. Could this be real? The intake process was mechanical, but shocking in its humanity. Men were deloused, their lice-infested uniforms burned. Medical checks were carried out to measure fever, malnutrition, and broken bones. A Japanese soldier with a bandaged arm expected to be ignored. Instead, an American medic inspected the wound, cleaned it, and dressed it again. The soldier sat frozen, unable to reconcile the act of care with the image of the barbaric enemy drilled into him. One prisoner whispered to another in disbelief, "Why would they do this? We are not their men, we are nothing." Another shook his head. "It must be a trick. Wait." The fear lingered. Every step felt like it might lead to the punishment they had been told would come. Yet each hour revealed something stranger, an unexpected adherence to the Geneva Convention. That phrase they had heard whispered before but never believed would carry weight. After registration, the men were marched across the yard to their new quarters. Snow crunched under their boots, the cold cut through their thin coats. But the barracks, though rough, were heated with stoves, lined with bunks, and stocked with wool blankets. It was not home, not freedom, but it was shelter. A few prisoners sat heavily on the mattresses, testing them with their palms as though afraid the softness would vanish. Barbed wire remained visible from the windows, a reminder that this was captivity. Yet inside, the men noticed something they could not ignore. The camp was run like a machine, yes, but not like a dungeon. The contrast gnawed at them. All their lives they had been told that capture meant degradation, that surrender stripped them of honor, reducing them to animals in the eyes of the enemy. But here at Camp McCoy, the first images imprinted themselves differently. A guard helping a sick man steady himself, a medic carefully wrapping gauze, a Red Cross representative checking that rations were distributed fairly. The men did not relax, not yet. Suspicion lived in their chests like a second heartbeat. But as night came and they lay on cots under real blankets, they could not help but wonder if the greatest shock was not captivity itself, but how captivity looked nothing like the nightmare they had braced for. For soldiers who had expected cruelty, the first day in Camp McCoy was the beginning of something they had no words for. But the true shock would not come with rules or barracks. It would come on a tray in the mess hall, carried by the smell of meat and the hiss of soda bottles waiting to be opened. The next morning, the prisoners woke not to blows or shouted insults, but to a bugle call. The sound startled many of them, not because it was loud, but because it was familiar. They had heard the same sound in their own camps back in Japan. For a moment, some forgot where they were, but then the reality came back with the clank of boots and the English voices outside. They were ordered into formation, roll called, and directed toward the mess hall. The fear of what might come next sat heavy in their chests. Many expected that food would be withheld, or that they would be fed scraps unfit for animals. Hunger had been their constant companion in the Pacific. Meals had dwindled to bowls of watery rice, sometimes barley, and if they were lucky, a few pickled vegetables. Meat was a rarity, sugar almost mythical. But before food, there were procedures. The prisoners were gathered in a large room where a Red Cross representative addressed them through an interpreter. He explained their rights under the Geneva Convention. They would be fed, housed, and allowed to write letters home. They would work, but only under certain conditions. They would not be abused. They would be visited regularly by neutral officials to ensure these rules were respected. The words were met with disbelief. Some men lowered their eyes, ashamed that they were hearing this. Others whispered among themselves, unconvinced. One soldier muttered to his friend, "They speak of rights, but we are their captives. Why would they bother?" The interpreter paused to allow murmurs to settle. "These are not promises. These are rules. For you, for them, they are binding." The weight of those words hung in the air. After that came medical checks, more thorough than the day before. A doctor pressed fingers into thin wrists, checked teeth, measured blood pressure. Prisoners were weighed, and many came in underweight. Some Americans shook their heads quietly at the numbers. Malnutrition was obvious, yet no one mocked them. A corporal even handed out vitamins, small chalky tablets that puzzled the men. Medicine for enemies? It was almost insulting in its kindness. By the afternoon, they were given fresh clothes, plain, serviceable uniforms marked with PW in large letters. The garments fit better than their torn remnants from the field. Some prisoners slipped into them slowly, hesitating, as though each stitch was a surrender of identity. Others embraced the warmth, shivering less as the Wisconsin wind pushed through the cracks of the barracks. The guards themselves were another surprise. Yes, they were armed, strict and watchful, but they did not spit on the prisoners or strike them for moving too slowly. They enforced order without cruelty. When one elderly prisoner stumbled on the icy path, a guard reached down and pulled him up by the arm. No kick, no sneer, just a curt nod before walking on. It was deeply confusing. That night, as the prisoners sat in their barracks, conversations ran low and heavy. "Can you believe them?" one man asked, staring at the ceiling beams. "They speak of rules as though this is an arrangement. Do they not hate us?" Another replied, "They must be pretending, to trap us, to make us speak." And yet when silence fell, the smell from the kitchens carried over again. It was thick, rich, fatty, not the sour, thin soups they knew from the islands, but something whole, something filling. Their stomachs growled involuntarily, betraying them. The Americans, it seemed, did not consider food to be a weapon. For them it was a routine, a Tuesday dinner, a Thursday lunch, nothing more. But for the Japanese prisoners who had marched half-dead through jungle and beach, who had hidden in caves gnawing on roots, and who had surrendered with bellies hollow and skins stretched tight, that smell was almost unbearable. Some pressed their faces into their blankets to block it out. Others whispered that tomorrow perhaps the trick would reveal itself. Perhaps the food was bait. Perhaps the kindness would vanish as quickly as it had appeared.
Yet, when the next day came, the lines formed again, and the trays were filled again, and the routine continued, steady and unshaken. The rules were real. The inspections were real. The procedures were real. And the strangest truth of all was slowly pressing itself against their expectations. America, even in war, believed in order. But the order of rules was nothing compared to what waited in the mess hall itself, where hunger and memory would collide with a hamburger and a glass bottle they had never seen before. The line moved slowly, boots scraping against the mess hall floor. Steam rose from trays behind the counter, carrying a scent so foreign to Japanese noses that many of the men could not place it. It was rich, heavy, smoky. Meat, yes, but not like the dried fish or tiny cuts they once ate at home. This was thicker, heartier, something closer to luxury. The prisoners clutched their tin trays like shields, waiting for the humiliation to come. Perhaps scraps would be thrown at them. Perhaps spoiled food would be ladled out with mockery. That was what they expected. Hunger made every second longer, but fear held them back from looking too eager. Then the first soldier stepped forward. An American cook, sleeves rolled to his elbows, dropped a hot patty onto the bun with a spatula, then added fried potatoes on the side. Finally, he reached for a glass bottle sweating with condensation, popped the cap, and slid it onto the tray. The red script on the label was unfamiliar, almost decorative. The Japanese soldier stared at the tray as if it were a trick. His hand trembled. "Move along," the cook said flatly. The prisoner shuffled forward, still staring. Behind him, others leaned to glimpse what had been given. Whispers rippled down the line. "Meat! They're giving us meat!" When more trays began to fill, disbelief deepened. The bun was soft to the touch, the potatoes fried golden, and the bottle? "Coca-Cola," a guard explained curtly, fizzed as though alive. In the corner of the hall, the prisoners sat at long wooden tables. They eyed the food cautiously, almost suspiciously, like men who had stumbled into forbidden territory. A few brought the bottle to their lips. The sweetness exploded first, then the burn of carbonation in their throats. Some gagged, coughing from the shock. Others widened their eyes in astonishment. One man laughed, an uncontrolled burst that startled his neighbors. Another covered his mouth and lowered his head, shoulders shaking, caught between laughter and tears. A thin soldier, ribs visible even under his new uniform, lifted his hamburger with both hands as though it might fall apart. He sniffed it, then bit in. Grease ran down his chin. He froze, chewing slowly, as if each bite might vanish if he moved too quickly. Then he lowered his face, hiding the tears that welled up. A bunkmate nudged him. "Are you all right?" The man swallowed hard. "I had forgotten the taste of fat." At another table, two prisoners debated quietly. "They want to make us weak. They fatten us so we forget our cause." "Or," his companion said slowly, "they simply eat like this every day." That idea was harder to swallow than the food itself. The mess hall filled with low sounds, chewing, muffled laughter, an occasional sob quickly hidden. For a group of men who had lived through the hunger of Guadalcanal, Saipan, and the home island's failing supply lines, the meal was more than nourishment. It was an assault on their assumptions. One prisoner later whispered to his bunkmate that the sweetness of the Coca-Cola felt like a dream gone wrong, too gentle to belong in war. The Americans serving the food noticed nothing extraordinary. To them, it was routine. They ate the same hamburger and fries, washed it down with the same bottle of Coke, and thought nothing of it. For the guards and cooks, feeding prisoners was procedure. But for the prisoners themselves, it was as if they had crossed into another reality. What shook them most was not the abundance, but the normality of it all. The Americans were not celebrating. They were not taunting. This was not a feast meant to impress. It was simply Tuesday dinner. That contrast hit harder than any insult could have. Here were men who had fought ferociously, who had been told that America was starving, decadent, on the brink of collapse, yet in captivity they were eating better than they had as free soldiers of the empire. The shame was sharp, but the relief was sharper still. By the time trays were emptied and bottles stood drained on the tables, the prisoners sat back in silence. Some folded their hands as if in prayer. Others stared blankly at the wall, trying to process what had just happened. The mess hall guards called for order, ushering the men back to their barracks. The prisoners filed out, still stunned, still whispering among themselves about what they had tasted. That night, lying on bunks under wool blankets, the memory of the hamburger and Coca-Cola stayed with them, not just as food, but as proof. Proof that their enemy lived in a different world, one where sweetness could be wasted on prisoners, one where meat was so common that it could be shaped into patties and handed out without thought. But food was only the beginning. Once the routines of daily life inside Camp McCoy took hold, the prisoners would face a new challenge: living with order, boredom, and moments of humanity that tested everything they thought they knew. The shock of that first meal lingered, but it did not erase the reality of captivity. Each morning, the prisoners of war at Camp McCoy awoke to the sound of roll call, boots crunching in the frost, rifles pointing toward them from the towers above. The barbed wire was always there, cutting across the horizon, reminding them that this life, no matter how different from what they expected, was still a prison. Inside the wire, routine ruled everything. After breakfast, prisoners were divided into groups. Some were assigned to shovel snow from roads, others to cut wood, still others to help on nearby farms under guard supervision. The work was steady, not brutal. It surprised many of the men that they were not being used to exhaustion. Instead, they were paid small wages in camp coupons, which could be exchanged for items at the camp canteen: toiletries, writing paper, even candy or cigarettes. One afternoon, a Japanese soldier held up a chocolate bar that he had purchased with his coupons. His hands trembled as he unwrapped it. "In Japan," he murmured to a fellow prisoner, "this is medicine. Here they give it away to soldiers like it is nothing." His friend shook his head in disbelief. The canteen itself was another shock. Prisoners watched American soldiers come and go, chatting casually, buying Coke or chewing gum, joking with the clerk. The casualness of it was almost unbearable. War was raging in Europe and the Pacific, yet here in Wisconsin, Americans seemed to live as though abundance would never run dry. Still, the daily structure of camp life began to press down in a different way. There was no fighting, no advancing, no dying comrades to bury. Instead, there was monotony: wake up, work, eat, sleep. The mind, which once was consumed by survival, now had space to wander. And with wandering came longing. Letters became lifelines. The camp allowed each prisoner to write 2 letters and 4 postcards per month. Heavily censored, but still precious. Men hunched over tables, scratching out words with pencils, trying to capture their homes in ink. "I am alive" was often all they could manage. Some received letters back, thin envelopes with kanji written in familiar hands. Others received none. For those men, silence grew heavier with each passing week.
English classes were offered in the evenings. A few curious prisoners attended, repeating words slowly after the American teacher: bread, table, window. Others scoffed, insisting there was no use in learning the enemy's tongue. But even the skeptics listened from their bunks, ears pricking at the strange rhythm of the words. There were moments of unexpected contact. A guard at the worksite once asked a prisoner, "Do you miss rice?" The interpreter relayed the question. The prisoner laughed bitterly and answered in Japanese, "Rice is a memory." When the reply was translated, the guard grew quiet, perhaps realizing the weight behind the words. Not all interactions were so gentle. Suspicion lingered. Some guards treated the prisoners with coldness, never speaking beyond commands. And within the barracks, arguments broke out among the prisoners themselves. Some clung fiercely to the idea that Japan would triumph, that these months of captivity would end in victory. Others, worn down by what they had seen, muttered that defeat was inevitable. One night, 2 men argued so loudly that the guard had to intervene. "You dishonor our homeland when you speak of defeat," one prisoner shouted. "And you dishonor reason by denying what is before your eyes," the other snapped back. The guards silenced them, but the tension remained. Even in the middle of America, the war lived inside their minds. Yet life in the camp also produced small human routines. Prisoners carved wooden toys during free hours, played improvised games, or simply sat together telling stories of home. The smell of the mess hall never ceased to haunt them, but at least it was steady. 3 meals a day, no matter what. That fact alone set this captivity apart from the jungle trenches and crumbling islands they had come from. In the barracks at night, silence often fell quickly after lights out. But every so often someone whispered into the dark, "What do you think your family eats tonight?" The answers never came, just sighs and the shifting of blankets. Daily life in Camp McCoy was not freedom. It was not cruelty either. It was something in between, a limbo where survival was certain, but meaning felt elusive. But the longer they lived within the wire, the more they began to notice something strange. Behind the strict schedules and guarded fences, moments of connection began to flicker between captor and captive, moments that could not be explained away by rules or routine. For weeks, the camp ran like clockwork. Guards gave orders, prisoners followed, meals came on schedule. The rhythm was predictable, even dull. But in between those routines, small cracks opened where humanity slipped through, moments that neither side could have imagined when the war began. It often started with the simplest thing: language. Few of the Japanese prisoners spoke English beyond a handful of words, and most Americans in the camp knew no Japanese at all. Commands were given through interpreters or gestures, yet necessity pushed both sides to improvise. A guard might point at a shovel and bark, "Work!" A prisoner, catching the sound, would repeat it awkwardly under his breath, "Waku." Soon others did the same, laughing quietly at their own clumsy attempts. One evening during an English class, an American instructor wrote the word family on the chalkboard. He asked for a volunteer to say it aloud. A prisoner stood, hesitated, then said, "Famure." The class burst into laughter, not cruel, but genuine, and even the teacher smiled. The prisoner smiled too, his face softening for the first time in weeks. In that instant, the label of enemy gave way to something more ordinary: men trying to bridge a gap. Food once again became a kind of common ground. On rare occasions, guards shared cigarettes or chewing gum with prisoners during work details. The gum baffled them. One man chewed for a few minutes, then swallowed it whole. The Americans roared with laughter, shaking their heads, trying to explain. Soon gum became a small symbol of exchange, a guard offering, a prisoner accepting with a stiff bow. There were also clashes. On a farm outside the camp where a group of POWs worked clearing fields, an American farmer watched them closely. His son had been killed in the Pacific, and resentment boiled in his stare. When one prisoner bent to pick up a dropped tool, the farmer spat on the ground near his feet. The guard escorting the work crew noticed, said nothing, but walked closer. The tension hung in the cold air, unspoken, but raw. The farmer turned away, muttering, "Should have left them to starve." That moment spread quickly among the prisoners when they returned to camp. "Not all Americans follow their rules," one said grimly. His bunkmate replied, "Of course not. They are men like us. Some will hate, some will not." Inside the wire, friendships sometimes grew where no one expected them. A young guard named Miller, barely 20, with a soft accent from Illinois, often lingered near the barracks after duty. He carried photographs of his family, showing them to prisoners who gathered near the fence. They did not understand his words, but they understood the faces: a mother, a father, two small sisters. In turn, prisoners traced shapes in the dirt, sketching their own homes, their villages, their wives waiting oceans away. It was not dialogue in words, but dialogue in images. One evening, Miller managed to say slowly, "Mother, father, about you." He pointed to the photos. A prisoner nodded, touched his chest, and said in Japanese, "Haha, chichi, imoto." The exchange lasted only moments before another guard ordered Miller away. But the seed was planted. They had spoken across the chasm, if only for an instant. Still, culture ran deep and suspicion ran deeper. Among the Japanese, loyalty to the emperor was not erased by Hamburgers or Coca-Cola. Some men whispered warnings against softening. They accused fellow prisoners who attended English classes of betraying their honor. In the dim light of the barracks, arguments flared. Was survival worth adaptation, or did every borrowed word, every moment of laughter with a guard chip away at who they were? One prisoner wrote secretly in his diary, "We were told Americans were animals, yet they share their gum, they heal our wounds. Which is the lie? Which is the truth?" The contradictions gnawed at them. For some, the kindness of guards felt like humiliation, a reminder that they lived better as captives than their families did back home. For others, those same moments hinted at something uncomfortable but undeniable. The enemy was not faceless. One snowy night, as lights flickered out across the camp, a prisoner whispered to his bunkmate, "If we survive this war, what will we tell our children? That our enemy fed us, that he gave us blankets, that he smiled at us." The bunkmate stayed silent for a long time before answering softly, "We will tell them the truth, even if it shames us. But the truth was complicated, and as the war dragged toward its bitter end, the contradictions inside Camp McCoy only grew heavier, until the prisoners were forced to face the question of what loyalty really meant. By the winter of 1945, the rhythms of Camp McCoy had settled into something the prisoners could not have imagined when they first stepped off the train. Hunger no longer carved their faces as sharply. Work, though tiring, did not break their bodies. They wrote letters home, some even daring to ask the guards how to spell English words. On the surface, life looked manageable. Yet under that surface ran a deep conflict, one that grew sharper as weeks turned to months. How could they reconcile this treatment with the hatred and loyalty they still carried in their hearts? Every night, debates flared in the barracks. Some argued fiercely that this was all deception, that America only pretended to treat prisoners well in order to weaken them, to steal their spirit before repatriation. One man stood up one night, voice harsh. "Do not be fooled. Our emperor demands strength, not comfort. Every hamburger you swallow is a betrayal." Others, weary of suffering, pushed back. "We are alive," one countered, "and if survival is betrayal, then what did dying hungry on Saipan achieve?" Silence followed those words. Silence and shame. Letters from home made the contradiction sting even sharper. When a prisoner received word that his family in Osaka survived on boiled weeds and scraps of barley, he held the paper in shaking hands while the smell of roast beef drifted from the mess hall. The gulf between his life as a prisoner and theirs as civilians under bombing raids became unbearable. "I eat like a soldier," he confessed quietly, "while my children starve." It wasn't only food. Warmth itself became a symbol. In barracks heated by stoves, with wool blankets and steady boots, the men remembered families shivering back in wooden houses with glass shattered from air raids. Captivity offered them safety, yet it deepened their guilt. Some prisoners clung harder to propaganda, repeating it like prayers. America was decadent, hollow, ready to collapse. But the evidence around them mocked those words. In the camp, Coca-Cola bottles arrived by the crate. Cigarettes were available not just for soldiers, but for prisoners. Work crews saw American farmers with tractors, barns full of livestock, fields that seemed endless. Abundance here was not fantasy. It was normal. One guard, overhearing a prisoner remark on the overflowing fields, said simply, "This is only Wisconsin. You should see Illinois." The prisoner lowered his eyes, ashamed of the envy burning in him. The contradictions broke some men quietly. One evening, a prisoner whispered through tears, "I believed Japan was the center of the world, but now I see perhaps we are only one small island." His bunkmates scolded him, warned him never to speak such treason aloud. But the thought had been voiced, and thoughts cannot be taken back. Religion added another layer. Some prisoners gathered in hushed circles, reciting prayers to ancestors, clinging to tradition. Others watched American chaplains lead services for their own men, and curiosity flickered. A few even attended, if only to sit in the warmth of the chapel. They did not understand the hymns, but they recognized the act of faith. Different gods, different rituals, but the same human hunger for hope. Perhaps the most painful contradiction came during Red Cross inspections. The officials asked the prisoners if they were treated well. Most answered yes, because it was true. But afterward, in the barracks, shame swept over them. "We admit our enemy treats us fairly, while our own nation cannot feed us. What does that make us?" No one had an answer. One snowy afternoon, a work crew was clearing a road outside the camp when a group of American children approached. They were curious, bold, their cheeks red from the cold. One girl held out a candy bar, offering it through the wire to a Japanese prisoner. He froze. He had faced bombs, bullets, hunger, but the innocent gesture of a child terrified him more than any weapon. He slowly took the candy, bowed low, and said in halting English, "Thank you." The girl smiled, skipped back to her friends.
That night, the man confessed to his bunkmates that he felt more broken by that small kindness than by all the battles he had endured. "A child of the enemy," he whispered, "gave me food with a smile. How can I hate her?" Such moments left scars of confusion. They did not erase loyalty to the emperor, nor did they end the war inside their hearts, but they made the line between friend and foe blurrier than propaganda ever admitted. As 1945 pressed on, the men knew the war outside was reaching its climax. Rumors of bombings in Tokyo, of losses in the Philippines trickled into camp. Each new report widened the contradiction. Inside the barbed wire, they lived with steady meals, shelter, even glimpses of humanity. Outside, their nation burned. But captivity, no matter how humane, could not last forever. The question looming ahead was simple and terrifying. What would happen when the gates finally opened and they returned to a homeland scarred by fire and hunger? By the summer of 1945, the world outside Camp McCoy had shifted beyond recognition. Whispers turned to headlines carried in American newspapers that the prisoners occasionally glimpsed. Through guards or Red Cross officials, the Allies were advancing in Europe. Cities in Japan were burning under waves of bombers. When Hiroshima and Nagasaki were struck, rumors raced through the camp faster than guards could silence them. Most prisoners did not fully understand what an atomic bomb was, but the horror of it bled through every word. Then came the truth they could not ignore. Japan had surrendered. The announcement fell over the camp like a weight no one could lift. Some prisoners stared blankly at the ground. Others wept in silence, their shoulders shaking under thin blankets. For years, they had carried the belief that their nation could not fall, that death was preferable to defeat. Now defeat had arrived while they were behind barbed wire, unable to lift a weapon, unable to choose their fate. Days passed in a strange quiet. The guards did not gloat. They simply carried on with the routines, meals, roll calls, inspections. For many prisoners, that steadiness was unbearable. They treat us the same whether we are warriors or defeated. Do they not see our shame? But the camp was already preparing for repatriation. The Red Cross began organizing lists, transportation routes, schedules. Prisoners were given clean uniforms, medical checkups, and briefings about the journey ahead. They would be shipped back across the Pacific, not as soldiers of a victorious empire, but as survivors of a war their nation had lost. The departure was not triumphant. On the morning of the transfer, the prisoners filed out of their barracks carrying small bundles of belongings. Some clutched wooden carvings made during idle hours. Others carried carefully folded letters from home, stained with tears and sweat. As they passed through the gates, many glanced back one last time at the camp that had held them. It was not fondness that moved them, but confusion. The place where they had expected cruelty had instead given them hamburgers, Coca-Cola, blankets, and even glimpses of humanity.
The journey home was long and heavy. On the ship, men huddled together, wondering what awaited them in Japan. Cities were gone, families scattered, hunger worse than when they left. They worried about being branded cowards, despised for having lived as prisoners. The guilt was sharp, but so was another memory they could not forget. The taste of that first meal in Camp McCoy. One man, scribbling in a worn notebook, wrote, "I thought my enemy would break me with violence. Instead, he broke me with food. I cannot erase the taste of bread, meat, and sweetness. It will follow me home like a shadow." When the prisoners finally stepped onto Japanese soil, reality struck hard. Bombed ruins stretched where cities once stood. Families met them with tears, relief, and sometimes bitterness. Some wives and children had survived on grass and tree bark. Others had not survived at all. The returning prisoners faced accusations of weakness, of dishonor. But in their silence, They carried stories no one at home wanted to hear. Stories of hamburgers and Coca-Cola, of Americans who treated them by rules instead of rage. In the years that followed, a few spoke cautiously about their time in America. They admitted that it had forced them to see the enemy not as monsters, but as men. Others never spoke at all, burying the memories under layers of duty and shame. Yet even in silence, the contradictions lived on. The legacy of Camp McCoy and other camps like it is not found in battles or victories, but in those quiet, disorienting moments when food, kindness, and order collided with fear and loyalty. For the prisoners, captivity revealed something uncomfortable but undeniable. Humanity could exist even in the middle of war. And perhaps that is the final lesson. Wars end, nations rise and fall, but the small choices, a guard sharing a photograph, a child offering candy, a cook sliding a hamburger across a counter, can leave marks that outlast the noise of cannons. For those Japanese prisoners, the taste of Coca-Cola and the grease of a hamburger became symbols of contradiction, but also of survival. They reminded the men that even enemies can show mercy, and that sometimes mercy cuts deeper than hatred. As one prisoner told his son years later, "I learned in America that kindness is harder to carry than cruelty. Cruelty you can fight, kindness you remember." War can strip men of everything, but it cannot erase the power of small acts of humanity, and that is the story worth remembering. These stories, though buried in time, still speak to us today. They remind us of the choices humans make in the darkest hours, choices that reveal who we really are.